them up. But Frans, I want to welcome you and hand over to you to share with us what you and your team have done at the Center for Risk Analysis in terms of understanding the background of South Africa and where this, the possible scenarios where it could take us. So thank you very much for being with the Business Book Club. And for being with us, Frans.
Jacques, it's very nice to be here. It's very nice always to be invited back. You never really, first time you might have made a mistake. To invite the author back is always a nice thing. The Rise and Fall is the third book we've published on South Africa's future. It's probably my last, I think. My publisher's not sure that she agrees with that, but I think it's the last one because I think we've got it right. And it's the culmination of a long-term project that really started in the aftermath of Thabo Mbeki's defeat in 2007 to try and plot the trajectory South Africa would follow over the next 2 decades. We published it at the peak of the pandemic, right in the middle of COVID, in the middle of the crisis. It was quite a good test of our ability to get long-term prediction right. I'm going to take you into some of the insights in a second. Tough time to publish, but very good test of the ability to do long-term foresight, and different, this book, to the first two, in the sense that since the first one, so many of the people who read us and use us and consult us have moved abroad, completely or partially, and we followed them in this book. So the Rise and Fall is really South Africa, but there's a lot about the rest of the world as well. Some of that I'll take you into this evening. If you agree, Jacques, what I intend to do is in the next, I think it's about 7:15, the next 20 minutes or so, just take you through some of the data we relied on in building the argument of the book. And then once I've done that, the two of us can have a chat and field some of the questions. Are you happy to proceed on that basis?
I think that would be appropriate, and that would give everybody an opportunity to understand, because there is a bit of theory and technical knowledge involved. So very happy for you to take us through that, Frans.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I've learned your system this afternoon. So what I hope you're seeing is on your screens is a chart, a slide that says the rise or fall of South Africa. Are you with me there, Jacques?
Yes, Frans. That's what I'm seeing. Okay. So I think we're good to go.
Okay, in no particular order, I just want to show you some of the types of information we used in building the argument about the book, and then as I get to the end, I'll tell you what the book's argument ultimately was on where South Africa is headed. We could have used an alternative title for the book, which is Avoiding False Horizons. We consult a lot to entities with interest in South Africa, and I think where many of them have got their long-term calls wrong is they've fallen for false horizons that were created in the media and elsewhere by very skilled communicators and politicians to get them to believe narratives about where South Africa was headed that didn't materialize. And the term false horizon is taken from flying, where a combination of cloud-covered topography and darkness makes it very difficult to know for the pilot where he's headed. Sometimes he could even fly upside down, he could fly into the ground. And through this book, we've really tried to take that away from our readers, take away the false horizons, give them a real horizon, which in the case of flying, one would do by forgetting your own sensory perception, leaving that aside, and relying on your instruments. Now, as analysts, we also have instruments available to us. And these are hard data, real trends, polling information, and the like, which the book is built around. Used in building the art that we relied on. And here's a good example for you, Jacques. This is polling we did before the election last year. And what it shows you is support for the African National Congress. And amongst people aged 65 and older, can you see my mouse moving around on that bar, Jacques, or not?
Frans, no, I can't see that.
Doesn't matter. You can't see my mouse? Then I'll explain to you what I'm seeing. Amongst people aged 65 and older, we've put support for the ANC at just below 60%, at 59%. Amongst people 18 to 29, support came in at 51%. And this was significant because, as you see in that little grey block to the right of your screen, South Africa is a country in which only a third of people are over the age of 35. And as that 65 and older block ages, there's ever less prospect of it participating in future elections. And if you run a future election just amongst people aged 35 and younger, or 30 and younger, it becomes a very much a 50-50 political battle. And that was one insight. There were scores, hundreds of these in the book. One insight that made us think, and this is where I'm going to take you this evening, that is South Africa standing on the brink of a realignment now on a scale of what the country last faced in the 1980s and the 1990s. Move on from that and look into the world of employment very briefly. Yes. The chart you're looking at, the bottom axis runs from 1994 to 2020. The red bars that you see are support for the ANC in national elections since 94. There have been 6 of those. And you read that off the left-hand axis. So the ANC starts at about 63% under Mandela. And then, Jacques, an amazing thing happened. A decade after Mandela, the ANC is 6 percentage points stronger than it had been in 2004. I'm being assailed by my dogs, Jacques. Let me just get rid of them, and I'll be back with you in a second. Here you go. Oh, puppy. I say, Jacques, I'm back. Sorry. It's the nature of things.
The nature of things. I'm sure you're not the first person who has had a dog on a webinar.
No. My dogs are here. Anyway, 2004, they're standing 6 percentage points stronger.
Yeah.
In the subsequent decade, they'll give up a vast amount of support, falling into the 50s. On top of that, what I've plotted for you is the number of people in South Africa with a job. It started, you read that off the right-hand axis, started about 8 million. It had almost doubled by the time Mbeki departed. And thereafter, the rate of job growth slowed down. And as the rate of job growth slows down, ANC support falls away. But through that period of accelerated job creation under Mbeki, ANC support grew very strongly. One insight, leave it there. We're going to build on it as we continue. Get into the world of corruption. Now, very
relevant
today. And there's a quote for you. The ANC is pained immensely by stories of corruption. We're highly conscious of the damage. Some cases we've probably been too legalistic. Approach needs to be reassessed. That's Cyril Ramaphosa, not his letter of 2 weeks ago. That is Cyril Ramaphosa in October of 1996 already. This is a long-running problem, and one that he has.
Just for interest's sake, Frans, what was Cyril's role then at 1996? What position was he in the ANC?
Well, he was then on the trajectory to succeed in Mbeki, which he fails in, because he's got to. He 96 is still under Mandela, but his real track is it's going to be he's going to succeed Mandela, and he fails at that. And it's the first great strategic miscalculation in the post-94 political career of Ramaphosa, and one that I'll suggest is repeated later on at a number of junctions up to the present. So this isn't a new business. This is, and you could basically lift that paragraph verbatim from what was said 2 weeks ago. Can he win it? I don't think so. This is newer data. It takes the National Executive Committee of the ruling party. There are 80 normal, ordinary members of that committee. It's a sort of the exco, the board almost of the party. 41 are arrested, implicated in serious corruption. 8 not implicated. Are serious about isolating and wreck the management ranks of that organization. We're not going to develop these points in great detail this evening. I'll just show you the sorts of information. Go to the fiscal world, point number 4, and this is budget deficit. Now, it's the difference between what the government spends and what it earns in revenue. The predicted deficits for this year and the subsequent 2 years are shown in yellow to the far right of your screen. And the point we make is that those numbers are on a par with what South Africa last experienced in the volatile 1980s, or before that, if you draw your eyes back, what happened in the Second World War, and before that in the First World War. Now, running out of money politically is a very important moment to reach. It focuses the mind and it can trigger realignments. It was that deficit and what stood behind it in the 80s that was very influential in triggering the transition. And before that, it's the deficit that and the consequences of the war that contribute to Smuts' defeat in 1948. The trouble for the ANC with running out of money is varied, but here's one insight. It's again 1994 to 2018. The red bars are again ANC support, so it's all the same. The little yellow dotted line that you read off the right-hand axis is the proportion of households in our country that do not have electricity. Now, when the ANC came to power, remember you read the yellow dots off the right-hand axis. Half of families go to bed every evening without an electrical light. Now, by the middle of the era, let's just go to 2004, that figure had fallen to 20%. It's a remarkable improvement. And it was true for delivery indicators across the board. Thereafter, as things stagnate, slow down, and begin to reverse under Zuma, support for the ANC starts to fall away. Is there a relationship between the two? It's the kind of point we tease out in the book. Move on from that quickly to social welfare. Again, the red bars are ANC support in national elections. So from 63, peaking at 2004, falling away to 57 under Ramaphosa last year. And the number of social grant beneficiaries is the yellow dotted line. Now, grant beneficiaries lift from around 2 million in 97, 98. There's this vast escalation between 2001 and really 2007, 8, 9. Thereafter, the number of beneficiaries, the curve begins to flatten and to plateau. While the beneficiary numbers were escalating very quickly, the ANC's popularity was rising. When it began to slow, ANC popularity itself began to slow. It must continue to slow because the deficit shows us the government's effectively run out of the money. It needs to expand its welfare programs. Go quickly to the question of policy. So many of our clients ask us, they asked us at Nasrec, would this be the reformist moment? And then after the election in 2019, would that be the reformist moment? We said to them no and no. Now they say, is COVID going to trigger structural reform? We don't think it's going to do that for South Africa. This is a spectrum we created of the policy positions of the government and its likely short to medium term moves. And the spectrum runs from dark red to dark green. Dark red are areas of policy that you're not going to get much of a move on. You might even see counterproductive decisions being taken, counter reforms. A dark green is intelligent structural reform. The areas that are red or dark red, where no reform is anticipated from us, are really critically important. It's everything from property rights through to the electoral system, and then from education through policing and energy, all the way to questions of small business development and the like. What that means is that from a policy perspective, we do not anticipate through the short to medium term, the book got quite strong on this, that there would be structural reform. We don't think Ramaphosa is leading a reformist administration. What that means is that South Africa's investment position is not going to improve through the short to medium term. Later on, Jacques, I feel I have to say this, we're quite upbeat on South Africa's long-term prospects. Short term, we think it's going to be tough. You're looking at a chart of fixed investment as a proportion of GDP. So how much fixed investment is South Africa drawing as a share of the size of its economy? The trend line from 94 was upwards into 2008. It fell terrible because of the lockdown. Investment figures won't rise, therefore growth doesn't pick up, and your fiscal position cannot improve. What also can't change is you can't beat unemployment without much higher levels of growth, which are predicated upon much higher levels of investment. Now, this is a like with like comparison of unemployment rates around the world. Red is in 2019, yellow is in 2020. There's a skyscraper there. That's South Africa. And the victims of that are mostly young people. And your audience can start to tie some of these strings together to the comments I made earlier about how the voting profile of younger South Africans is very different to the profile of South Africans that kept the ANC at comfortable majorities for much of the last 20 years. We also know this stuff. You know, if you want to be a professional analyst, you need very high quality information, and you've got to create some of that yourself. And polling is one way to do that. Here's voter perceptions. Are you satisfied or unsatisfied with how the ANC is doing on the economy and job creation? 70% of ANC voters were unsatisfied before the lockdown. This is pre-lockdown data. Position subsequently for the party has worsened. This is February 2019, so this is before the election. Do you think South Africa is moving in the right or wrong direction? Right direction for all voters and black voters are the red blocks, and the wrong direction, all voters and black voters are the orange blocks. Now we hear it a lot. There's a lot of it in the media again this week. That black South Africans, white South Africans, they hold different opinions based on race on a range of issues. In our work, we devoted a whole chapter of the book to it, to polling we've done on that. Nonsense. South Africans, comfortable 8 out of 10, are in the same place on the same issues. They want the same thing. The media perpetuates an illusion that South Africans are fundamentally divided on questions of race, and that this is a stumbling block can never be overcome. Our insight is that is not true of our country. And if it's not true, it opens the way to political options that I'm going to get to for you in a second. One more, just an insight on the consequences of not being able to grow the economy and create the jobs is that confidence in the future of the country, confidence of its own people in its future, continues to decline. The red bars are the political data for the ANC. The orange bars are a polling question. Are you confident in the future? And look at that. Almost 70% of people, well, you read off the right-hand axis, almost 60% of people were confident on the dawn of Jacob Zuma coming to power. By the time he left, confidence in the future had fallen to 20% of South Africans. Take you to violent protest action. It shows the inverse of confidence data. The yellow dotted line this time is what proportion of all protests are violent. So it used to be 10% in around 2010. Now it's about 30%, very apt this week with the disgraceful behavior of the economic freedom fighters in terrorizing shopping centers and malls, and equally disgraceful behavior of prosecutors and law enforcement, that this sort of nonsense is not stamped out on the very first morning. But the trend line, you can see it's part of a growing trend line of violent protest action. On energy, quickly, I'm due to be load shedded in half an hour, so it's most appropriate. Eskom, not good. This is the number of gigawatt hours of electricity distributed by Eskom from January 2013 into virtually the present. The trend line, I'm afraid, is sharply downwards, and we've been telling clients, we write in the book as well, that from an Eskom perspective, South Africa cannot aspire to a growth rate of much over 1%. But break Eskom up, float the price, and welcome private producers and green producers into the country's electricity market, and we can, towards the end of this decade, again aspire to the growth rates that we last experienced when Thabo Mbeki was in charge. Getting that growth rate back is, for the ANC now, absolutely everything. This almost last chart, I think, from me on the local South African stuff is ANC support in the red bars again against economic growth. And we've been telling and the economy are tied to each other. if the economy sinks, you're going to go with it. My experience, I'm going to say a bit, reveal a bit this evening. Very few ANC leaders take that message seriously, and they might pay a terrible political price for that in the longer run. Quickly look at the rest of the world, give you an idea of the sort of kind of thinking. We brought this up to the present for this evening. This is our estimate of the race in America at the moment. We think Trump is trailing Biden by only 8 in the American Electoral College, which elects the American president. In the non-swing states, Mr. Trump is marginally behind. In the swing states, the stuff was updated this afternoon by Becky Mahlobo, who writes these briefings for me. And I see Becky's putting Mr. Trump ahead of Mr. Biden now. To the right, you see 3 states. The first one is Michigan. The second one you'll recognize as Florida and the Panhandle. And the third one is Pennsylvania. And the numbers are the number of electoral college votes in each state, meaning that the way these states move, the sort of big battleground states, this race is not over and done at all. And Mr. Trump is still in it. And he's not a man to bet against. So he might come out on top. Lastly, for this evening, show you a little bit about the virus. And this is really good news globally. We think the virus is dead, stone dead, really, relative to what it was. There are no second waves, no second peaks, will be none. Now, you say, well, that's pretty bold stuff. How do you know? Show you a selection of countries here. The red lines show you new daily infections in those countries from late December last year into a couple of days ago. The black lines are deaths. To be a peak, your death number must follow your infection number on a particular lag. You can see how many countries experienced that in their peaks. Italy, there's epicenter, great example. Germany had a classic peak. France had the same. The US had it as well. Why are you reading about second wave infections? You're reading about second waves because after the peak, infection numbers again rose. Germany shows it nicely. Italy shows it. Look at the US. France, dramatic. The deaths aren't picking up. These are not peaks because for the peak, our definition of the peak, deaths must follow infections. This is a host of other things. People going back to work, being tested, found to be carrying latent bits of virus, herd immunity developing, etc., etc. It's really good news for the global outlook and economy and South Africa because it means the world has already beaten this pandemic. Quick word, Jacques, I'm going to just hijack this very quickly. People are interested in us. Welcome to get involved in the Center for Risk Analysis, which is through which we do this work. There are individual subscribers to the center. There are institutional subscribers. Send an email to Sherwin at crasa.com and he'll give you more details. We do a vast number of things, all sorts of notes. I do a podcast with Becky on a Monday morning. It's a protected behind a paywall podcast on all major global and South African risk. Do a lot of advisory work as well, and you can find us for free on YouTube. The books, we started because the books weren't printed when we launched it. So we started on Amazon for Kindle, and now they're printed books as well. And Jacques, that is it from me to give you the background for this evening. And excellent. I look forward to fielding the questions.
Well, great. Thank you, Frans. That was massively insightful. A lot of data, and I'm sure that we could actually have a whole evening discussion regarding some of them. But I'm going to try and just take up some of the nuggets, and then we'll see what our audience is asking. And one of the things that came through my mind while you went through this presentation, Frans, is some of the data is pretty obvious. And being a business coach, I know that the numbers don't lie. You always, if you want to know a story, go into the data. And then you look for the trends because that tells you, in a sense, what possibly your scenarios could be as close as possible to accurate in the future. Now, what's your relationship with the ANC? Like, surely they've had access to this data. Surely there are some intelligent leaders there that can interpret it. Or are they clouded by political agendas where they don't necessarily care about the data and it's more about corrupt agendas that they are driving, which I'm wondering about.
I think there are a few things. One is the management structure, and structure of the ANC insulates it against reform. Nigh on 100 people need to agree on what to do before it moves in a particular direction. And these are people whose interests are very much at odds with each other, ideologically, politically, and criminally as well, which is important in the ANC. If one side wins, the other side goes to jail. If the other side wins, the country fails. It's not an entity in the idea of a corporation. It's got a chief executive who makes strong decisions and carries the burden of being right or wrong. It's a collective mentality, which means reform is impossible. At junctions in its history, we write a bit about those in the book, it has broken out of that. Mandela was very strong at Davos in 1992 in charting a new course for the ANC after the effects of being caught up in the Soviet and East German embrace since very much caught up since the 1960s. But Ramaphosa is not that man. He's a consensus seeker. He's a builder of bridges, tries to move slowly. All might be good things, totally the wrong thing for South Africa's leader at the moment, and that's why he's losing. So number one, the management structure means it can't change. Second issue, business in South Africa misses this one and has done for decades, I suppose. Ideology. Ideologies inform policies. They determine why people behave in a particular manner. Ideologies are the reason that some societies are hugely successful and others are failures, even in the face of the evidence. The ANC, after Mbeki, imprisoned itself in an ideological cage of its own making, from which it now cannot escape. Essentially the idea that wealth is inherently illegitimate, and the creation of wealth as well, and therefore that economic growth shouldn't be a primary policy objective in practice. A third problem within the organization is it's lost its better people. They've left. The caliber of it's a useful thing to do. You can find some of them on YouTube. Go and look at parliamentary debates in the mid-1990s. It's just a different class of thing. It wasn't brilliant, but it functioned. Compare it to the pandemonium, a fist fights. It's not the same thing. So the caliber of people aren't there. And I think very important insight is the ANC's best people didn't come back with Ramaphosa to join his cabinet. And that's important. That was an important insight. So here are some of the reasons. Corruption now is one too, because the extent of it, I think, is much greater than the public suspects. And for the corrupt, if South Africa is one day well governed and successful, they might go to jail, and that's quite a motivation. So the ANC's analysts are good. They know the stuff. It's never a case of ignorance of the consequences of policies. It's a case of accepting the consequences of counterproductive policies. And that is very much, in my experience, the problem. Jacques, back to you.
Okay. So I guess, because I know that in your previous books and in a lot of your history, your research, you also compare South Africa to other countries who've got similar population growth, where you would have, your voting mass a much younger age, and then what that does to the political structure. So I'm sure that there's case studies of that happening previously. It's not just France and his organization that surmises that, right?
No. It's been done previously. You can listen to Tito Mboweni speak, and some of the ideas he articulates. It's essentially the same message, that you need to grow aggressively in order to meet popular demands, in order to retain your political standing and credibility in a society. and that an ANC that presides over a low-growth South Africa is really setting the clock ticking on its own demise. And that was the central thesis of the book, which produces a number of scenarios at the end of the book, which is our method. But in only one of them was the ANC in charge of. In two of the scenarios, is in the hands of a new administration by 2029. And should that play out, I think that was what I suggested would play out. Should it play out, and I'm later asked why, the answer rested in the economy. And Mbeki and Mandela understood it so well that you need to attract high levels of investment and growth if you're going to meet popular expectations. In the subsequent decade, that lesson was lost on the ANC, and it's paying a terrible price as a consequence. Jacques.
Frans, let's go to our audience. I can see, Chris, you asking a question there. Does the COVID-19 pandemic provide a convenient excuse for the ANC government to try and shift its own failures before the pandemic? Frans.
Yeah, Chris, I think yes. I think you'll see a great attempt at that over the next year or so as more economic data on South Africa is released. I think you will hear policymakers say this isn't our problem, this is our fault, this is because of the pandemic. It's not because of the pandemic, it's because of the lockdown and the nature of the lockdown in South Africa that was very counterproductive, particularly after its first 2 to 3 weeks. The real question, Chris, is will it help? And I don't think it helps anymore politically, the ANC, to say, the economy is growing slowly, but it's not our fault. The polls we do, the data I read that I've read for so many years is what people care about now, is the fact that the economy is growing slowly. If the best you can come up with is to explain to the voting public that it's not your fault, that's not going to see you perform particularly strongly in a future election. I think what COVID's done, Chris, is to accelerate into 3 months trends that would otherwise have taken about 3 to 4 years of South Africa, and has therefore accelerated the prospects for the political realignment that the book is essentially predicting. Jacques.
Okay. Frans, also earlier today on Facebook, we got a bit of an interesting question by a person with the name of Temba Tsepo Muguni. He unfortunately used profound language. We had to block him, but I still think that his question was relevant in terms of, posing the question in terms of your book title, saying, what rise are you really talking about? There never was a rise in the first place relating to South Africa. He then went on with more political conversation, which, I don't think it's important to elude. But I do think the point is made, like, what rise are we talking about, Frans? Which your title alludes.
The question of the book is, will South Africa reach its potential as a middle-income society in the 2030s and 2040s? Potential the country's always had, never achieved, because its governments have been ranged between cruel and racist and incompetent and ideological. So the book was, the question of the rise is, will we become a middle-class society with a Western standard of living, which the great majority of people in the country will aspire to and reach? In other words, will poverty be defeated? Will unemployment be defeated? Will people live very comfortable and prosperous lives? Can South Africa ever be that country? And yes, there were 2 avenues in the book to that. So we thought that's still on the cards for the country. I'm not sure what your man is unhappy about, but the fall would be, does South Africa undergo such a terrible series of reversals that it essentially becomes a failed state? And we warned in the book, don't think that I can almost quote the paragraph of the book. There's nothing about South Africa, its history, its people, who are all wonderful. its place in the world, its political leaders, or its economy that means it cannot be the next Venezuela. So we warned that that was a prospect of decline, a dramatic decline. But no, the upside, and the publisher Tafelberg, Marina Lamprecht, does this book for me there, and she said to me, "No, you have to tell the people what it's going to be. You can't leave it at the scenario." So I did that. And what I ultimately said is, I think it's the rise. And towards the end of the book, I wrote this. As ever, yourself in all the scenarios. That's instinct. My instinct is that the ANC is going to be defeated. South Africa is going to move center right in the next decade, because that's where mainstream opinion, public opinion is. And we will become very successful through the 2030s and reach our potential middle-class status, mainly middle-class status society in the late 2040s. So that was my ultimate conclusion.
We'll reach middle states in the 2040s.
40s. We'll be, by the late 2040s, we'll be well on our way to becoming a middle-income society.
Okay. So that's another 20 plus years from where we are at this stage, Frans. You and I will look a hell of a lot different than what we are today.
It's been 20 years already since the transition, more.
Yeah.
And it's if I often speak about clients that have a proper understanding of time. If you think long term, Chinese firms and clients are so nice to talk to, because they've got absolutely no problem with the kinds of time frames that we think in and write in. If anything, it's a tiny bit of history. I find Western type firms, maybe it's a function of Western culture, think that 20, 25, 30 years is a very long time. It's an interesting experience I've had in my work. Yeah. What's next, Jacques?
No, I mean, for me, it's just interesting to understand. I mean, the difference between your book that we previously had a conversation of and your book now, a lot has happened, but you're also painting a different picture as your end game.
Yeah, not entirely the different picture. Look, we wrote 3 books. First one was to start, and we were getting going in this, and it was fine. We changed the names of the scenarios each time. And that was just as we upgraded our thinking. But the scenarios in book 1, book 2, and book 3 are fundamentally the same. Our instincts in book 1 were right about what could happen, a sort of realignment where the ANC is defeated. We call the ANC defeat for the first time in 2012, when we're first time on the record in the media, ANC is going to lose. From us was 2012. So the analysis became more refined, more detailed. We found more information. We buttressed our initial sense. But our first book scenarios that were developed into the second and now the last lot of this lot never really changed the broad outlook for the country over the full number of years that it took to complete this project.
Okay, but I mean, in this book, what I definitely read or that I took away is that your advice to individuals is to create a lot more options, which you weren't so explicit about in your previous, in your previous books. This time, what I got a sense that you were saying, guys, the reality is hitting us hard. We need economic growth. There's been no real change in policies to support that. We were hoping on maybe 1 or 2 catalytic events. They haven't happened. Now you've got to be, if you're in a position to create more options, that has to be part of anybody's game plan. And you bring out stuff in the book about the CEO of Brenthurst, Magnus Haystack, about how he sort of started to sell some of his property, making himself a bit more liquid, and creating options in terms of your asset base, your career, where your family and friends, and where you actually position yourself as a location.
Yeah, you're very right on what we did on advice in the book. I was wary in the first 2 books because it's a very great responsibility. It's one thing to show people what's happening. It's another thing to tell them what you think they should do. So I left it out of the first 2 books. It's always advice we gave consulted us. Changed that in this book, and the reason I was comfortable doing it and writing that chapter is because I will be in the same boat as the people who listen to that advice. I'll be able to look them in the eye and say, this is what I did, the same things, for better or for worse, right or wrong. I think it's the correct advice. And what it really was, Jacques, is if you want to survive in a very volatile emerging market, anyone, South Africa happens to be the one we're in, success and failure will be determined by a number of things, including choices. The more choices you create around your assets, around your career, around your children, and around where in the world you live, the more robustly positioned you will be. If you have virtually no choices, we drew it up as little quadrants in the book. Your assets are your wealth, your money, your investments, your place in the world, where in the world can you live? Or in South Africa, your kids, what can they do? And your career and your work, what can you do? Can you move around? If you've got no choices in those quadrants, then you're terribly exposed to strategic risk in any emerging market, in South Africa too. If you've got a lot of choices across those quadrants, then you really don't have much to worry about. Then all that you need to do is to know what's going to happen. You said that earlier. I think you're very right. Just know what's happening, whether it's good, bad, right, wrong, in short to medium term won't matter to you, because you've got the choices to navigate around obstacles and threats and seize opportunities. And a number of my colleagues are people who would have the ability to work anywhere in the world that they chose, and they choose to be here in South Africa. And if you walk around, well, when we used to have offices, we've abandoned that now, a benefit of the lockdown. Our office was a happy place, positive, upbeat people, and they knew terrible things. They knew just how corrupt the government was. They knew Ramaphosa wasn't a reformer. They knew that business had got many of its ideological calls wrong. Why were they happy? Because they had choices and options, and they could take advantage of South Africa doing so. They were here out of choice, not because there was nothing else for them to do. And if the book does anything for, and I've spoken a lot to. I speak a lot to sort of banks and things which are fine and nice, but I'd be, what would make me happy if an ordinary family read this thing and found some of the advice useful and it helped them to be successful and prosperous in South Africa's next 20 years. That would be very good. I'd be happy about that.
That would be your objective of the book. Frans, before we wrap it up completely, there is just one last topic that I want to cover, and it's because the Business Book Club and myself, we're very passionate about this. And one of the advices that you presented in the book and the option that you have to create is for the next generation. And you spoke a lot about the schooling system, and you mentioned 3 things which you've got to look after for your kids. And if people that are listening, if you're a parent, if you're involved with kids, Frans in his book mentions these 3 things, and I totally resonate with it as the importance in terms of education. And that is ensure that kids can do mathematics, because that teaches you the ability to solve problems. Teach them how to do, language, because language gives you the ability to communicate, which is extremely important in fostering relationships. And the third one is understanding philosophy, because philosophy creates empathy, it creates understanding for other religions, for other ways of thinking, It helps you to understand a bit more where the world comes from, and it allows you to think broader than your narrow perspective and your narrow environment that you're in. And Frans, maybe just one or two thoughts from your side on this specific subject, because I think maybe you as a parent feel that, man, I haven't got that European passport. There's no freaking ways that I can go. I don't have money to necessarily go outside of this country. But freaking, then if there's one thing that you can do is, make sure that you can do something for your kids and make sure that the education for them is of such a quality that they can excel in those three areas. So
we wrote a chapter on tech, which was a great chapter. It was kind of the sci-fi chapter of it's a chapter I enjoyed the most. I did it with a colleague, Herman Torres. It was kind of the sci-fi chapter of the book, where we 20 years be. And work will change forever. It's changing already forever. People will no longer be trained, except for in a few rare cases, in their youth to fulfill jobs that they will do for the rest of their lives. They will be retrained time and time again throughout their careers to fulfill jobs that at the moment you cannot think of because they do not exist and functions. And what's going to make someone really successful and in demand in that environment? I mean, the old idea of being trained as an accountant, working for a firm, retiring after 40 years of hard grind is done. What's going to make that kid globally in demand? Number one, his maths is excellent. Number two, he's language proficient around the world. You can put him into any environment, anywhere in the world, he'll function. And number three, he knows how to think. And that's where philosophy comes from. And with thinking, also empathy and so on that you mentioned. Mm. And if you put your kids in that position, that they have that skills base, then if they do their bit, I'm pretty confident that regardless of the sort of swings and roundabouts that will shape the world in South Africa in the next 20 or 30 years, your children will have prosperous and successful futures.
Yeah, that's on that. Frans, I know we're turning the corner. It's 2 to 8, but there's one last question that I see here on our forum. What might happen to pensions? And maybe we can just quickly cover that. Thank you for Preston for that question. Frans, let's answer that. Let's wrap it up, and then hopefully we beat load shedding.
Beat Eskom. Okay, try beat Eskom pensions 1 minute. What's going to happen? Look, I know it's very hard. You've got the currency to consider, of course. You've got the South African market to consider, and you've got the question of prescribed assets to consider. Now, your risk there is the government's essentially run out of money. Internal unity in the ANC is secured by many things, including cadre deployment policies of the government. Cadre deployment needs cash. Public cash through the fiscus is getting ever less. So the model needs to pivot into the private sector. If it pivots the cadre deployment model into the private sector, it will use prescribed assets or something equivalent to prescribed assets, even if they realize the word is now toxic, to compel savings, financial institutions, people who administer your money, to invest in projects that in the longer term will not offer you a competitive return. And in that case, your pension funding is your pension standing in real terms, in dollar terms especially, is in peril. Can be stopped, but I'm getting a little bit beyond my brief for this evening, but I would say it's a risk, and you need some advice on it. We've done quite a lot on it. I'd be happy to talk to people. My colleagues would be properly about it if they make contact with us over the coming week. But prescribed assets would see, essentially what prescribed assets would mean, Jacques, is that politicians around the current administration who are not great would decide how capital in the country needs to be invested over the heads of what markets have already determined. and that's not going to be good for pension holders in South Africa. I see one of your guests says that load shedding has been recalled for this evening. That's very nice to know. But it is also 8 o'clock, and I've had a great time this evening. Thank you very much for getting me back. I really do appreciate it. Thank you to all your guests who've been on the call this evening. And thank you to you and to your colleagues for setting it up.
Frans, thank you very much for attending us and for being and sharing your knowledge. Just a quick one, Frans. I see that right at the beginning you skimmed over it a bit, but very interesting, the 290 subscription a month to your organization. I mean, you guys are doing a hell of a lot for our country in terms of researching stuff. Just briefly tell me, if I'm a business owner and I want to subscribe for 290 Rand only a month, what type of information and insights would I be getting from your organization?
We used to work only for very big institutions. We've now changed that. We're letting individuals in and see how that works. So far, it's working nicely. What you get from us is the following. Every Monday morning, I do there's a paywall behind a podcast of all and a related risk. You receive regular invites to webinars that we host for along the lines of the next one is a deep dive insight into the problem of corruption around the ANC. So the stats, the data, what's the government likely to do on corruption? What is the NPA likely to do? What's the party likely to do? And how to anticipate events around that. So you get invitations to webinars. You get various notes and comments that we send out. The only thing you don't get as an individual that an institution gets is you cannot ask us a question directly and we address it for you, because we'd simply be overwhelmed by demand. Absolutely. And you can't get a bespoke product. So an institutional client will say, can you guys put something together for us on prescribed assets, for example? How great's the risk? And brief our clients, we'd be able to do that for them. But the individuals get the generic off-the-shelf geostrategic risk material, and they can get that on a free trial as well to feel us out before they commit to us.
And I guess, Frans, I mean, the last thing I want to say, we don't want to use this as a marketing platform, but it's really important that knowledge gives you power. And for small business owners to have the knowledge about the options that they need to create. And it's like you said in the beginning about your staff, you know, even though they know all the stuff, they still come to an office, they're upbeat because they've made choices knowing the knowledge, because that for me is the difference between optimism and being what's the word I'm looking for, Frans?
Unrealistic.
Yeah, where you just being unrealistic about what's going to happen in the future. So I really think that could be something of massive benefit. Frans, I want to really thank you and your team for the research, for what you've done. Thank you for being on the Business Book Club interview spectrum, being our author of the month. We really, really appreciate that. To Bronwyn and the team behind the scenes, thank you for all your help. Bronwyn, I'm going to hand over to you. I still think there's an announcement that you have to make in terms of a winner, if I'm not mistaken. So Bronwyn, I'm going to hand over back to you. And Frans, once again, thank you very much for attending our interview.
Thank you to you guys, and from my side for this evening, good night.